It is much more of a conversation than someone reading a prepared text. Notes are prepared for the briefers. What actually becomes the most important thing that I certainly recall about those briefings was the various and specific cases we went through and how they are examples of concern or not concern, that we then have to behave in certain ways or have follow-ups on this or that. I mean, it is much less a large theoretical briefing and much more concrete.
The Prime Minister testifying at the elections interference inquiry this week, saying he doesn't always read intelligence briefings prepared for him and does rely on oral briefings, something Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre rebuffed today.
The Prime Minister was asked why he didn't do anything about this interference, even though he was warned in briefing notes, is that he doesn't read briefing notes. Now, we often don't believe the things that this guy says, but I think that most Canadians would believe that defense.
The Prime Minister was asked again today about foreign interference and more specifically his level of confidence in Canada's intelligence apparatus. Have a listen to what he said.
It is a very active role that we play in constant conversation with our top intelligence officials as they make decisions around what it is that is credible and pertinent to share with us. And we will continue to listen very closely, very carefully to everything they put forward and make sure that we are all doing everything necessary to keep Canadians safe.
The front bench is back to unpack what you just heard. Christy Clark, John Tory, and Tom Mulcair. Tom, I know that you consumed a lot of that testimony yesterday. What stood out to you?
Well, there are some clear contradictions, especially in Mr. Trudeau's testimony. They were being briefed along the way. Dominic LeBlanc said something very different in French, and then he came back after and tried to correct it. In French, he had said, "Oh, I don't recall any details, that type of detail being given to me by CSIS." First of all, for a lawyer at that experience who's in charge of democratic institutions to say he doesn't recall if they had given him the name or the details of the writings, strained credulity. With regard to Mr. Trudeau, there's the essential question of his discussion where he boasted through his staff that he had scolded President Xi of China. That's November 2022, the G20 meeting in Bali, Indonesia. Mr. Trudeau spent long minutes, like 15 minutes, explaining, well, you know, sometimes the information's not reliable. That had been already teed up for him by Katie Telford in her testimony. You know, we get stuff that's full of mistakes, you know. Now he's trying to backfill that today. So, you know, we love CSIS, they're great. So he had enough information. He always said, oh, the key thing is to have information that's solid, something that you can believe. So he believed the information was solid enough for him to go and scold one of the most important leaders of one of the most important countries in the world for interference in Canadian elections. Because they all said, well, we only learned about this when it made it into the articles in the Globe and Mail, but a lot of that stuff came after that scolding in Bali. So there are big holes in it, but I don't think that any of the moth-eaten holes in that particular sweater, any of the loose ends, I don't think any of it is going to amount to much. I think the Liberals did exactly what they had to do. Even though there was stuff bubbling over onto the stove, they managed to keep enough of a lid on this thing. It is going to remain covered up. We'll get a report that says, oh, there's got to be better communication between the political side and the intelligence side. I don't think it's going to go any further than that. No smoking gun. Unless something is produced later in this inquiry, I don't see it going much beyond that, frankly.
What's your sense of that, Christy?
I think Tom's right. I don't think this is going to go much beyond that. It's too hard to nail it all down. And at the end of the day, when you look at what CSIS, what we know about what CSIS has provided, there's no smoking gun there. Like there's no way to say that it happened. It was, its intelligence sources tell us this and tell us that. Well, is that people just listening in the community to what people in the community are saying? Because people say a lot of things. That's absolutely true. And I think about the Prime Minister coming out and accusing the Indian government of killing a Canadian or being involved in that, and saying that was based on information they had from CSIS. Well, when you look back at that information they had from CSIS, it could be true or it could not be true. but really it was based on hearsay from the community. So, you know, I have to say I'm more sympathetic to Mr. Trudeau's argument here than I frequently am. But I also think that, you know, when hearing Mr. Poilievre say, gee, you know, if you don't read all, implying that if you don't read all your briefing notes about everything, that somehow you're not doing your job, I think really misjudges how hard it is to be the prime minister of a country and how busy you are. I mean, even as the premier of British Columbia, if there was something urgent about you know, some law and order issue that was absolutely urgent that I hear about, it would not have come to me in a briefing note that would have had to find its way up the, you know, take 10 days to find its way up through the bureaucracy. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I think the reason that that line of questioning existed, John, was because the briefing notes that had been tabled from CSIS were pretty explicit in detailing what they perceived the threat on foreign interference to be. That said very much so that the PRC was conducting clandestine efforts to interfere in both those elections. So the reason that he got those questions was because, like, did you see that? Did you read it? Were you briefed on it? And then, as Christy points out, the leader of the opposition jumped on the idea that the prime minister was saying, well, I don't, you know, like lots of this is just conveyed to me in oral briefings. It's a conversation. I don't read everything. There's been lots of, to both Tom and Christy's points, there's been so many little details that it's hard to keep track of all
Yeah,
this.
and I agree with everything Tom and Christy have said about this whole thing. And I think right now it's not going to amount to sort of some great big nuclear, you know, meltdown that might have happened. But that's partly because the documents, that what we know of them, it said things that there were things going on, but nothing that was, you know, of catastrophic proportions. They're all of concern. But look, on this briefing point too, I mean, you know, Pierre Poilievre is really the master at doing this kind of thing, which is to kind of switch the channel away from something that was going to turn out to be a lunch bag letdown to some other issue that made the prime minister look like an idiot because he doesn't read his notes. And most people will know, certainly the three of us all know, I'm one of those people that wants to read and be briefed, but the briefings are useful because I can ask questions, but the reading is, but there are many other very effective leaders in business and in politics who don't read a lot. They rely on people to come and tell them, you know, what they need to know and to make a judgment. That's what you're really there for, is to make the judgment. And that's what this really turns on, is when they were given the information they were given, you know, which was there was some stuff going on. Did they exercise the right judgment in saying, for example, on Han Dong and his situation, we're not going to boot him out as a candidate and whatever. And that's in the end what this will come down to, is judgment, not whether you read papers or whether you could have a test on them later. He had a briefing, and that's fine. Lots of people learn best that way. And I think this is very disingenuous to talk about that.
The only contradiction I just have a minute left, Tom, to bring up is that when the chief of staff to the prime minister testified in another inquiry, she went to great lengths to say the prime minister reads everything, every single thing that crosses his desk. So I take everyone's point. You're right, of course, but I think because of that contradiction, it did jump out at people.
As soon as she said that, I spoke with somebody I know who's been in the art and the craft of politics for decades as well. And that person just laughed and said, that sentence is going to come back to haunt them. Because, of course, she was being boastful. You know, Mr. Trudeau, I mean, there's always this thing, you know, was Gerald Butts his left hemisphere, you know, or his right-hand man? No, they always try to say, no, he's an amazing leader. He does all this on his own. He's super leader. And so she was boasting about his abilities. And then they had to come up with a different narrative. Yes, it's a contradiction, but there are tons of contradictions. I mean, the whole idea of saying you never move on this stuff until you're really sure, and then saying, but we didn't know anything until it appeared, you know, in Bob Fife's and the other articles in the Globe and Mail, that doesn't hang together. But since we've just spent 10 minutes discussing this, the average Canadian just makes an instantaneous impression. This is complicated. They didn't prove anything. I mean, the essential argument from the Conservatives was what? Trudeau knew about this, did nothing because he knew it was going to hurt the Conservatives more than it was going to hurt the Liberals. That was the end game, to try to get to that. They haven't gotten to that. They have not got that, I don't think. Unless, again, there are documents that the commissioner has that she's going to be able to reference that weren't public. Maybe she can build a different case, but I don't think it's there.
Okay, I got to leave it on that note. Thank you so much to our front bench. Appreciate it. Christy Clark, John Tory, and Tom Mulcair. Our take